New here? We uncover the stories written in your DNA. Subscribe so you never miss one. A DNA lab in Porto found something in 2015 that didn't fit the map. Genome samples pulled from the southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula carried ancestry signatures matching populations more than 1,000 kilometers away, across open water, on a different continent entirely. Not a trace, not a rounding error, a layer thick enough to reshape how an entire population's genetic identity gets read. The region sits at what ancient Greek geographers called Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia, the edge of the Red Sea, the southern rim of the peninsula, guarding a narrow choke point between two landmasses that history nicknamed the Gate of Grief. Bab el-Mandeb, 3 findings came out of that lab, and none of them got resolved. One community here carries a DNA layer that reads more African than Arab. One isolated island off the coast has genetic ties to South Asia that don't match anything on the mainland. And one religious minority's ancestry has turned into a full-blown scientific argument nobody's settled. Here's the number that should not exist on this side of the peninsula. Coastal populations here carry sub-Saharan African ancestry at a mean proportion of roughly 0.61, nearly double what shows up in Saudi Arabia just to the north, and higher than anywhere else measured on the Arabian mainland. This is Yemen. And geneticists have been careful, almost too careful, about saying out loud what that number implies. If the ancestors of modern Yemenis carry more African and South Asian DNA than Saudi or Gulf Arab populations, were the original Arabs ever really Arab at all? The story historians have told for 2,000 years starts with wealth, not blood. Greek and Roman geographers called this stretch of Arabia, Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia, a name earned by the incense trade that ran through it. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from trees that grew almost nowhere else on Earth, made this corner of the peninsula one of the richest regions in the ancient world. Caravans and ships moved that wealth through ports like Aden, Kana, and Mosha, pulling in traders and travelers from India, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. Out of that wealth rose a sequence of kingdoms. The Sabaeans first, the biblical land of Sheba, then Ma'in, home to the Manaeans, then Kataban, then Hadramaut. By the 1st century BCE, the Himyarite kingdom had absorbed them all, ruling a unified South Arabia that lasted until 525 CE. The engineers behind that wealth built the Marib Dam, one of the ancient world's genuine marvels of hydraulic engineering, irrigating farmland that fed an empire for centuries. When the dam finally failed in the mid-6th century, the collapse was significant enough to be remembered generations later in the Quran as the flood of the dam, Sail al-Arim. The language these kingdoms spoke reinforced the story historians built around them. Sabaic and Himyaritic, catalogued extensively in Christian Robin's corpus of South Arabian epigraphy, belong to Old South Arabian, a branch of Semitic separate from the classical Arabic that arrived centuries later. Different language family, different root population in the standard reading of the inscriptions. Put it together and you get the textbook version. An ancient, distinct, Semitic-speaking population sitting on top of trade wealth, evolving in relative isolation until Arabic and Islam arrived. Yemenis, in this telling, aren't just Arab. They're often treated as the most Arab, the closest living population to the pre-Islamic Semitic-speaking people of the southern peninsula, minimally mixed, holding what researchers have often described as the purest regional genetic signature. The Marib Dam itself is worth pausing on. Sabaean engineers built a sluice system wide enough to irrigate a stretch of desert running to thousands of hectares, turning it into one of the most productive agricultural zones in the pre-modern Near East for the better part of a millennium. That kind of infrastructure doesn't get built by a scattered, disconnected people. It gets built, in the standard telling, by a settled, organized, deeply rooted population that had been sitting on this same ground for a very long time. Ancient kingdom, distinct language. Isolated bloodline, ancient dam, ancient flood, ancient wealth, clean. But one region inside this supposedly ancient, unmixed kingdom carries a genetic signature that the incense route story, on its own, cannot account for. Here is where it gets complicated. The number that broke the ancient, unmixed model came from a 2015 genome-wide study out of the University of Porto led by Veronica Fernandez and colleagues, screening 741,000 genetic variants across 420 Arabian and 80 Iranian individuals. Think of a genome the way you'd think of a family recipe rewritten across generations. Every ingredient anyone ever added leaves a trace that never fully disappears, even centuries later. That's admixture, a measurable share of ancestry from outside the group being studied, still detectable in the DNA of people alive today. By that measure, Yemen doesn't look like the rest of the peninsula. The sub-Saharan African component averaged around 0.61 in Yemeni samples. Compare that to roughly 0.49 in Oman, 0.35 in the UAE, 0.28 in Saudi Arabia, 0.16 in Iran. Sub-Saharan. The Y chromosome data, the paternal line, passed down from father to son almost unchanged, like a surname written in molecules instead of ink, tells a strange, complicating second story. Research from Cabrera and colleagues in 2010 and Al-Zahari and colleagues in 2011 found Yemen holds some of the highest frequencies in the world of a lineage called haplogroup J1M267, a paternal marker tied to ancient Near Eastern pastoralist expansion. That's a deeply Near Eastern signal, not by chance, by pattern. The same 2015 study mapped where the African signal actually concentrates in the genome, and it isn't scattered randomly. A region on chromosome 9 turned up heavily enriched for sub-Saharan ancestry across the peninsula, sitting near genes tied to reproduction. A separate region on chromosome 2, enriched instead for South Asian ancestry, overlaps genes connected to lactose digestion and immune signaling. Later research comparing populations across the peninsula added another layer. The Hadrami of Yemen came back as a genetic hotspot, among the most heavily admixed groups measured anywhere in Arabia, while Qatari Bedouin populations, by contrast, showed up as a cold spot, barely touched by outside ancestry at all. Same peninsula, same rough time depth, wildly different genetic outcomes depending on which community you sample. But follow the maternal line, mitochondrial DNA. The genetic thread passed only from mother to child, generation after generation, largely undisturbed by anything the father contributes, and the picture flips. Coastal Yemeni populations, particularly along the Tihama lowlands, carry elevated frequencies of haplogroups L0, L2, and L3, lineages with African origins, a Near Eastern father line, an African mother line, both layered into the same population, the same villages, sometimes the same families. Researchers are careful to frame this as a probability, not a certainty, but the geography offers an obvious clue. At its narrowest point, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait separating Yemen from the Horn of Africa is only 20 to 30 kilometers wide. For millennia, that gap functioned less like a border and more like a highway. And here's the part that recontextualizes everything from the Trade Kingdom story, work building on Fernandez et al., 2015, alongside a 2011 University of Florida study by Non and colleagues on Red Sea coastal gene flow, has pushed some shared ancestry timeframes back well before the historically documented slave trade era into a much older, pre-Islamic window of contact across the strait. The ancient, isolated Semitic kingdom from the textbook version was never isolated at all. It sat directly across a genetic doorway to another continent, and that doorway may have been open far longer than anyone assumed. And the African signal isn't even the strangest anomaly sitting in Yemen's DNA, because one island off its coast doesn't genetically match anything on the mainland at all. The first theory says this doesn't need a complicated explanation at all. It needs a well-documented one. Historians call it the Red Sea slave trade hypothesis, and the paper trail behind it is real. From roughly the 7th century CE through the early 20th century, enslaved people were transported from East Africa through Red Sea ports into the Arabian Peninsula as part of the broader Indian Ocean slave trade network. Historians' estimates for the full span of that trade vary and remain contested, but figures commonly cited run into the hundreds of thousands, with some cumulative totals pushed above 1 million across the centuries the trade operated. The genetic dating lines up with that timeline, at least on the surface. Some admixture dating studies place the bulk of African gene flow into coastal Yemeni populations within roughly the last 750 to 1,200 years, a window overlapping comfortably with the documented slave trade era and the earlier Islamization period that reshaped migration across the region. Historians studying the Indian Ocean and Red Sea trade networks have long treated these two eras, the rise of Islam and the centuries of maritime slaving that followed it, as the two biggest engines of population movement into the southern peninsula, and on paper, the genetics and the history line up well enough to close the case. There's supporting texture here too. The Hadrami hotspot fits neatly into this theory on the surface. Hadramaut's own ports sat directly on Indian Ocean trade and slaving routes for over 1,000 years, giving the slave trade hypothesis a clean, geographically obvious mechanism to point to. Trade route. Historical record. Matching time frame. Explained, or so it looked at first. Except it isn't fully explained. The slave trade hypothesis struggles with something the highland versus coastal divide keeps surfacing. Population structure in the Tihama coastal lowlands looks meaningfully different from the Yemeni highlands just a short distance inland, and a purely trade-era explanation doesn't cleanly account for that split. If the African ancestry arrived mainly through ports and maritime trade routes over the last 1,000 years or so, researchers would generally expect it to thin out gradually moving inland, in a fairly even gradient. That isn't quite the pattern the data shows. It also doesn't account for older shared lineages turning up in some interior populations, genetic threads that, by some estimates, reach back further than any slave route could plausibly explain. The slave trade explanation accounts for a lot. It just doesn't account for everything. There's a second, older, far more complicated layer sitting underneath Yemen's DNA, and trade routes alone can't explain it. 1896 words, right in target range. Let me output the final view for delivery. The trade route story explains the last 1,000 years. It doesn't explain the tens of thousands before it. The second theory doesn't start with ships or slave markets at all. It starts more than 100,000 years earlier, before Yemen was Yemen, before there was an Arabia Felix or a Himyarite king, or a single inscription in Sabaic script. In 2011, a team led by Simon Armitage and Hans-Peter Erpmann published findings in the journal Science from a rock shelter called Jebel Faya, on the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf. The stone tools they uncovered there, hand axes and scrapers, dated to roughly 125,000 years old, and their style matched tool-making traditions from Northeast Africa far more closely than anything else found in Arabia at the time. The implication was direct. Modern humans had walked into Arabia from Africa itself, tens of thousands of years earlier than most models allowed. Here's the mechanism that made the walk possible. Sea levels during that period didn't sit where they do today. During a glacial phase roughly 130,000 years ago, falling sea levels narrowed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the same 20 to 30 kilometer gap that separates Yemen from the Horn of Africa now, down to a corridor of only a few kilometers wide. Not a sea crossing, a walk, or at most a short paddle, across shallow water at the doorway between two continents. Now stretch that logic forward into the genetic data. If modern humans entered Arabia through this corridor across multiple ancient windows, then some of the African genetic signal sitting in Yemeni populations today isn't necessarily a layer that got added later. It may be residue, the tail end of an original founding population that never fully replaced itself, never fully diverged from its African source the way populations further north and east eventually did. Under this model, Yemen isn't holding foreign ancestry. Yemen may be holding original ancestry that other regions simply lost. And that reframes the entire slave trade explanation. If some of this signal predates the Islamic era, predates the Himyarite kingdom, predates agriculture itself, then the African DNA running through Yemen was never only a story of people being brought in from outside. Some of it may be the story of people who never fully left in the first place. A founding population sitting at a crossing point, absorbing new arrivals across tens of thousands of years, without ever being wholly displaced by them. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability rather than certainty, and for good reason. Modern population genetics is genuinely bad at cleanly separating a 100,000-year-old ancestral signal from a mixing event that happened a few thousand years ago. Both can leave similar-looking traces in modern DNA. Making it worse, ancient DNA recovered directly from human remains in this part of Arabia is almost non-existent. The heat and aridity that make the region so livable for trade also destroy the biological material scientists would need to test the theory directly. The southern route hypothesis explains why an African signal could be ancient. It cannot yet prove that the specific signal sitting in Yemeni genomes today actually is. This is the part the genetics alone still can't settle. And an island sitting off Yemen's own coast makes the puzzle even stranger, because it barely matches either explanation at all. The island is Socotra, and geographically it barely counts as Yemen. It sits roughly 380 kilometers from the Arabian mainland, and only about 232 kilometers from the Horn of Africa, closer to Africa than to the country that governs it. A 2009 study led by Victor Cerny, working with researchers including Luisa Pereira, sequenced mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA from Socotri Islanders, expecting to find the same African signal showing up on the mainland. They found the opposite. African ancestry on Socotra turned out to be minimal. Instead, the island's genetic profile leaned toward Arabian and Southwestern Asian ancestry, carrying a distinctly South Asian thread, plausibly tied to Socotra's centuries-long role as a waypoint on Indian Ocean trade routes moving frankincense and aloe resin. Two details make Socotra look less like a simple offshoot of the mainland and more like its own separate story. Most Socotri men carry a rare Y chromosome lineage called paragroup JP209, found almost nowhere else on Earth except across the water in Oman. And most Socotri women carry mitochondrial haplogroup N, a lineage so uncommon elsewhere that Cerny's team described the island's maternal DNA as showing signs of long-term isolation and its own independent homegrown evolution, genetic material developing in place rather than arriving fully formed from somewhere else. Think of Socotra's biology as the tell. The island is so isolated that over a third of its plant species, the bottle-shaped desert rose, the umbrella-shaped dragon's blood tree, exist nowhere else on the planet, a level of endemism that earned it UNESCO World Heritage status. Its genetics may be preserving something just as singular, a founder population isolated long enough, and visited sporadically enough by sailors from India, East Africa, and the Arabian mainland across different eras, that it never fully absorbed any one of those genetic pools completely. This is the theory researchers treat with the most caution of the three, and they say so explicitly. It leans on a single, decades-old study, a small and endogamous island population, and no confirmed timeline for exactly when that isolation began, or how many separate contact events shaped it. It's the least resolved thread in Yemen's genetic story, a data point that refuses to fit cleanly into either the trade-era story or the deep-time African story, sitting instead in its own unexplained category entirely. Picture the docks at Kana, a little over 2,000 years ago, at the height of the frankincense trade. The air carries the sharp, resinous smell of stacked incense cargo, sacks of it, waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for Alexandria and Rome. A vessel from the Horn of Africa is unloading ivory and aromatic gum alongside a ship that arrived from Gujarat carrying cotton cloth and pepper. A Roman merchant argues over weight and price with a local broker in a language neither of them fully shares. This isn't imagined detail. It's the world documented in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a first-century Greco-Roman merchant's guide that lays out, port by port, exactly this kind of traffic moving between India, East Africa, and Arabia, through harbors like Kana and Moshka Lemon. Every one of those ships carried more than cargo. Sailors overstayed a season waiting for the right monsoon winds to turn. Traders married into local families to secure better terms on future voyages. Enslaved people, brought through these same ports, were absorbed into households and never left. A dock worker born in the Tihama lowlands might spend his whole life never traveling further than the harbor, while the ships passing in front of him carried people who had already crossed 2 oceans to get there. None of this shows up in the Periplus itself. The merchant's guide only records cargo manifests and sailing directions, port distances, and which harbors to trust in a storm. But it's the only way to explain what modern genome sequencers would find waiting in Yemeni DNA 2,000 years later. Layer after layer of ancestry, laid down quietly, one ordinary trading season at a time, by people who had no idea they were building a genetic record anyone would ever try to read. Here is where the whole story finally turns over. Yemen was never a pure, isolated Arabian population that occasionally let outside DNA in through the back door. The evidence increasingly points the other way. This may be one of the oldest continuously inhabited genetic crossroads on the planet, a place where the categories Arab, African, and South Asian are modern labels stapled onto a population that never fit cleanly inside any one of them to begin with. The sharpest illustration of that inversion comes from a group most outsiders would assume is the least authentically Yemeni community in the country, Yemenite Jews. A landmark 2010 genome-wide study led by Doron Behar, published in Nature, compared genetic data from 14 Jewish diaspora communities against dozens of non-Jewish populations worldwide, using dense genome-wide arrays rather than the older, cruder marker sets earlier studies had relied on. Yemenite Jewish samples formed their own distinct genetic subcluster. Geographically, they sat closest to Bedouin and Saudi Arabian populations, their actual neighbors for close to 2,000 years. But genetically, they retained a distinguishing signal tying them back to a shared Middle Eastern and Levantine ancestral pool, a signal largely absent from their non-Jewish Yemeni neighbors, pointing to relatively limited genetic mixing with the surrounding host population across the centuries, despite living alongside them the entire time. Here's the irony researchers are careful to state plainly, without overclaiming a precise figure. The community most often treated as the outsider group, the minority whose origin story has been challenged and politicized for decades, turns out to carry one of the more continuous, traceable threads back to the ancient Levant. Meanwhile, the mainstream Muslim Yemeni Arab population, the group most often assumed to hold the purest, most ancient, most unbroken Arabian bloodline, carries the more unexpected signal. The deeper African layer, the Y chromosome and mitochondrial split, the South Asian input running through the coast. A researcher working on Yemeni population genetics once put it to a colleague more simply than any paper could. Identity here was never a locked box passed down whole. It was always a container that stayed open, and something kept getting added to it, generation after generation, long after anyone stopped keeping track. Layer, that's the word every honest study keeps landing on. The label Yemeni turns out to be one of the most genetically composite identities on the entire Arabian Peninsula. Not the purest, as the textbook story once assumed, but among the least singular. Pull the camera back and Yemen stops being the exception. Every population once treated as pure or original, once genome sequencing actually gets applied to it, turns out to be a palimpsest, a surface written on, scraped back, and written on again by migration, trade, conquest, and quiet coexistence, stretching back not centuries but tens of thousands of years. Basque populations, Sardinians, Ashkenazi communities, Andaman Islanders, every one of them was, at some point, described as a genetically untouched relic of the deep past. Every one of them, under closer sequencing, turned out to carry its own hidden layers. Bab el-Mandeb is the thread that ties every layer of this together. The same narrow gap that let the first modern humans walk out of Africa some 125,000 years ago is the same 20 to 30 kilometer strait that, tens of thousands of years later, carried frankincense traders, enslaved people, sailors waiting out a monsoon, and entire families who simply never went home. The door never fully closed, it just changed who was walking through it, century after century. Modern identity wants a single point of origin, one bloodline, one homeland, one clean answer to, where are you really from? Yemen's DNA is a quiet rebuttal to that entire premise, and it isn't the only place that rebuttal is sitting, waiting to be read. The Yemeni were never who the textbooks assumed they were, and the deeper the sequencing goes, the more it looks like neither is anyone else.